podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and before we get started with the topic for this week, unfortunately, it seems I've had to do this far too many times in just a year and a half or so that I've been doing the podcast, where, I don't know, I've never been one to be super impacted by the passing of superstars, movies, music, musicians, actors, those kind of things. But then there are some people that are just so notable for different reasons in my life. But I think at least one of the people I'll talk about is in all of our lives before we kind of dive into the topic this week. So first of all, just want to say that this is the 75th episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. So that in and of itself is an achievement of which I am extremely proud. And frankly, that would have been last week had I not had COVID once back in the, when was that? Sometime last year. And so this is technically would have been the 76th, but nothing particularly special going on for this particular episode. I thought about different things that I can do, but they all seemed kind of right on the nose. So right out of the gate, 75th episode. For those of you who have been with me right from the beginning, thank you so much for being on this journey. And for those who, keep jumping in every week, maybe you don't listen to every episode. Some topics just don't reach everybody, and that's okay too. But every time that you come back and you take a listen, I really do appreciate it. But in the time that I've done these episodes, there have been these losses. And the first one, I have made it clear many times on the show that I'm a huge pro wrestling fan. And growing up in Connecticut, it was always about the WWF and now WWE. And I'd mentioned when I kind of gave up my little journey, my little memory of pro wrestling and where I've, kind of progressed with it. And I'd never had the opportunity to see much of the NWA and Georgia Championship Wrestling. And sometime in 89, I think it was, I was over a girlfriend's house during Easter, Thanksgiving, I don't know, some kind of holiday like that. Excuse me. And her aunt and uncle had cable, and they had channels that I didn't have. So I've mentioned before, I didn't get cable till very late, and we didn't have like the most expansive cable package, but they had something that I did not, and that was TBS. And TBS, of course, ran Georgia Championship Wrestling. And the very first time that I had the opportunity to see it, it just so happened that they were playing the moment where Ric Flair had defeated Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, and it went to judging, right? So they were evenly matched rivals. They'd had these storied matches, 5-6-star matches, just amazing chemistry together in the ring. Steamboat being the consummate babyface, and Ric Flair being the dirtiest player in the game. And Rick ends up winning on points. He gets the belt, and one of the announcers, who is also a prominent pro wrestler, came into the ring, seemingly to celebrate and congratulate the champ, only to turn on him in that moment. And it was someone that I'd recognized from the pro wrestling magazines. And his name was Terry Funk. And Terry Funk, in that moment, became a heel once again, turning Ric Flair, who had, like I said, been the bad guy. You kind of love to hate Ric Flair, and everyone kind of still does. That's just how Ric Flair is. And they ended up having a legendary match. That was an I Quit match. But it was Terry Funk putting Ric Flair through a table, a pile driver through a table, which is something that hadn't really been seen on American television. And was really the precursor to what we, came to know as hardcore wrestling. Terry Funk, always ahead of his time. So there were these guys in these magazines, and I had mentioned that early on in the show's life, that I would see these magazines, and it would be guys like Ric Flair, covered in blood, and Dusty Rhodes, the Crimson Mask, as they would say. And Terry Funk would be right there. So here's a guy who is wrestling royalty. Amarillo, Texas, the Funk family. He's a second-generation wrestler. His father, Dory Funk Sr., his tag team partner and brother, Dory Funk Jr. And then Terry Funk went on a crazy run in Japan doing deathmatch wrestling with Cactus Jack, a.k.a. Mick Foley, Mankind, Dude Love, many gimmicks. A guy that I had first got to see in, world-class championship wrestling and the USWA, and as Cactus Jack. So these legendary guys that I was able to see in these different contexts eventually made their way to a company out of Philadelphia called Eastern Championship Wrestling, which then was dubbed Extreme Championship Wrestling, where Terry Funk headlined. Did it headline their first pay-per-view, which is barely legal? So it was either Sabu and Taz on top, or it was Terry Funk versus Raven for the title. Nevertheless, Raven, always one of my favorites, and a storied rivalry with Tommy Dreamer, who was protege of Terry Funk, both in storyline and in truth. And last week it was announced that, I guess at the age of 78 or 79 years old, Funk, who had been dealing with some health troubles, which got exacerbated when his wife passed away in 2019, unfortunately passed away. And so many tributes went out. But here's a guy that, for many outside the wrestling bubble, he was like one of the bad guys in Roadhouse with Patrick Swayze. He was Morgan. He was a tough. He was a thug. Worked for the bad guy, and just being very, very Terry Funk and all that, because he was this tough guy who kind of had a soft-spoken voice. And that's what kind of made him more menacing, Oh, everyone always does an impression of Terry Funk, and he's kind of soft-spoken. It's just an amazing guy, an amazing performer who continued to wrestle into his 60s, I believe, at a high level, late 40s into his 50s. And then, at a slower pace in his late 50s to early 60s. Guys doing moonsaults off the top rope. Crazy stuff. So rest in peace to the Funker, Terry Funk. But also in the wrestling world, so Terry Funk was 70, late 70s. He then had a young man who is a third-generation wrestler. Went through a number of gimmicks, but his father is Mike Rotunda, who is known as Erwin R. Shyster, IRS, as one half of Money Inc., a legendary tag team in the late 80s, early 90s, with his grandfather being Blackjack Mulligan, one half of the Blackjacks, Blackjack Mulligan, Blackjack Lanza. Wyndham Rotunda, who is known first as Husky Harris and then as Bray Wyatt, a.k.a. The Fiend, unfortunately passed away at the age of 36 years old, leaving behind a wife, 4 children, all little. And I was thinking back, my own life where I was at 36 and having a bunch of little kids. I mean, obviously he's made more than I've probably, will ever make. The point of that is I'm sure he's able to leave them behind in a great position at age 36, at least financially, than I ever would have been able to. Regardless, it's a 36-year-old man who is in the prime of his life, building a beautiful life, a guy who at that age has already cut himself a relatively legendary career. And nothing's really been announced, at least nothing that I've seen of what the cause of death was. And I know that's a morbid thing to ask, but you can't help but wonder, what was it so young, knowing that these are high level athletes who put their bodies through so much. And there were some reports that he had been dealing with a injury or illness that was potentially life-threatening, and nothing really more that I've seen has come out about it. So Again, 36 years old, far too young. And rest in peace to Wyndham Rotunda. And then the last one, which is a little bit of a segue into the main body of the episode tonight. And that's only because tonight's episode is going to be about television. And at least for a couple of generations, this guy was the voice and the host of our sick days. There was precious little on during the day that was as enjoyable. It's not like, 24 hours. Any kid who's homesick nowadays can stream cartoons. Age and interest appropriate things for kids. But for us, usually what you watched was The Price is Right. And of course, the host of The Price is Right for many, many, many years was Bob Barker. So unlike Terry Funk, who, great longevity to be in your late 70s, that is, just past the, average life expectancy here in the U.S. Obviously, Wyndham at age 36 is tragic and horrible. For the family of Bob Barker, I'm sure it is no less tragic and horrible, but 99 years old. And there was a silly meme that said, wow, that's such a Bob Barker thing to do because he didn't want to come in at 100. He kept it at 99 because that's how you play the game in The Price is Right. But, you just can always imagine that skinny microphone that he had and his just way with the crowd and the way that he talked to, what do they call the girls? The showcase, showgals, I don't know, whatever it was, but just he had such a way about him. But also turns out that like a wicked sense of humor, which was, I think, most evident in Happy Gilmore, his fight scene with Adam Sandler. I believe he was a staunch vegetarian and, animal activist. And I know that for a period of time in the 90s, I was gifted the shirt because it was a friend of mine's, I think, who then wasn't going to wear it anymore. And I took it over, which was a Bob Barker ringer tee from Urban Outfitters that said, "Chicks dig me," because Bob's the man. But 99 years old. Every year that I get older, I think of those ages of all the people that I've mentioned tonight. And it's such a weird thing. Age and how where you are in life dictates how you view a certain age. I remember getting to about 45 and going, 65, that ain't old. That's not too far away. And I remember my stepdad saying that when, his mom passed away and she was in her 70s. And he's like, it's still too young. Just the perspectives that we gain as we're going along. But rest in peace to those three individuals. Just too often. Like I said, I don't normally get impacted. The only time I've ever really I think I mentioned it on the Taylor Hawkins episode, maybe, because that one hit me really hard. But the one that hit me the worst was definitely Carrie Fisher when Princess Leia passed away. That was a rough one. I'd never felt like that before, related to just an actor who I've only seen on the screen, never met in person. That one got me really hard. But that being said, tonight's episode is about television. It's all about TV. And I had been thinking, okay, what can I do? 75th episode. We'll do the songs of 1975. We'll do the TV of 1975. We'll talk about the band the 1975. Let's do something 75. 75 top 10 hits of, I don't know. How do you have 75 top 10 hits? I guess 75 number one hits. I could have done that, I suppose. But it all seemed so on the nose. And frankly, I don't know what sparked my brain on this. But then as I started going through it, it became more and more interesting to me because there were some things that I didn't know. And that's why I do this. I end up learning something as I'm going along. Now, mind you, I know all of this is trivial. But hey, Gen X, it's kind of our thing, right? Being a little bit on the trivial side. The infantilization of America. So I was wondering, what were the top rated shows by season, like each year? So just for the purposes of defining what Nielsen and the networks considered a season, it was basically, for the longest time, October through April. Those are your seasons. Now, that changed, okay, in 1973, and it went from September till April. Now, I'd have to look up the reasons why that period changed. I'm imagining that the length of series was expanding. I don't know if this has anything to do with syndication, because they always talked about there's this magic number. You needed to have 100 episodes of a show to go into syndication. And I know that syndication was growing quite a bit at this time, particularly the earliest days of cable. But I said to myself, let's just do the 70s. So for the early Xers, 1965, you would have been 5 years old in 1970, and you may remember some of this stuff. Everyone's families are different. Maybe you were allowed to stay up. But what I found so interesting is that in looking at the 60s, it was kind of an interesting mix. But one of the things that is glaring is that you went from the sitcom, and the legendary sitcom, if you will, which is basically I Love Lucy, which ran from 1950, like 1950 to 1955 or 56, something like that. Let's see, ran from October 15th, 1951 to May 6th, 1957, with a total of 180 half-hour episodes spanning those 6 seasons. And basically, it was number one every year but its first year, which makes perfect sense. But it was like comedy. And then it got dismissed or replaced, if you will, by the Western. And like the Westerns kind of dominated everything from, Gunsmoke to Bonanza, with other sitcoms kind of here and there, some variety shows like Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, Candid Camera was in there. I think Pyramid, like the game show, Pyramid was in there, like whatever $100,000 pyramid, and then it became like a gajillion dollar. But anyway, then we get into the 70s, right? So in October 1970, the top show was Marcus Welby, MD, right? And this was starring Robert Young and James Brolin. James Brolin been on TV a long time. And Here's Lucy was on the top 10, but also there's all your, your Westerns are still there. There's shows like Hawaii Five-0, a lot of like medical dramas and stuff like that. But in 1971, October 1971, Marcus Welby is no longer the number one show on TV. And it's not going to be ever again, because this show becomes the show for 6 seasons, I believe. So starting in 1971, All in the Family was the number one show. Now, there's shows on the top 10 like Sanford and Son and Mannix and Adam 12 and the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Here's Lucy. That's your top 10, right? Sanford and Son moved up to the number 2 spot in 72, but All in the Family, 72, 73 to 74. In 73, 74, MASH breaks into the top 10. 74, 75, All in the Family, Sanford and Son. But here's what's so interesting. You have a spinoff. The spinoff from All in the Family, The Jeffersons, is now number 4. Very curious to me. But then, does this make sense? Weird. Okay. That's very interesting. I never would have expected this. So something that I had mentioned, this has got to be an error on this list. It's got to be, because it doesn't make sense. Oh, I guess it does. Interesting. So in 1973, outside the top 10 was a little show called Happy Days. Now, Happy Days was sitting at number 16 and was not even in the top 30 in 74-75 at all. I mean, the top 10 in 74-75, All in the Family, Sanford and Son, Chico and the Man, The Jeffersons, MASH, Rhoda, Good Times, The Waltons, Maude, and Hawaii Five-0. That is such a 70s lineup. And like, I read it out loud and I go, oh my gosh, like this is mind blowing. Because part of it is that I'm born in 74. Some of these shows are still on the air years later. Like, I mean, just juggernauts of television with major lifespans, which is fascinating to me. But what's throwing me off is that Happy Days not being there. So, yeah, 75, 76. It's number 11, but it's a spinoff show. So it already has a spinoff. Laverne and Shirley is in the top 3. The spinoff is crushing the show it spun off of. Your top 10 is All in the Family, Rich Man, Poor Man, Laverne and Shirley, Maude, Bionic Woman, awesome, Lindsay Wagner, Phyllis, Sanford and Son, Rhoda, The $6 Million Man, also being outpaced by the Bionic Woman. Interesting. And the ABC Monday Night Movie, number 11, is your Happy Days. So then, in 76, 77, and I'm wondering if this is when they changed the format of Happy Days, where it went from being shot, you know, on film, basically looking like a movie, to kind of that closed set style, just the, you know, soundstage, like the prototypical setup for your sitcom. But it's Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley. I think that might be the only time. Holy cow. Oh, it gets more interesting with Happy Days. Just you wait. But 76 to 77, Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, ABC Monday Night Movie, MASH, Charlie's Angels, yes. Every young man of any age of the 70s. You could be born in the 60s, the 70s, certain parts of the 80s, and you know Charlie's Angels, and you crushed on one of them. One of them. There was something for everyone. A lot of it was Farrah Fawcett, sometimes Jacqueline Smith, sometimes Kate Jackson, and then, you know, was it Cheryl Ladd came later? Anyway, the big event, I don't know what that is. I don't remember that. If anyone knows, let me know. $6 Million Man, another ABC Sunday night movie. Oh, your Monday night movie and your Sunday night movie. Beretta, One Day at a Time. And then for the first time on the list here, number 8 is a 3-way tie with a Sunday night movie, Beretta, and One Day at a Time. And then number 11 is Three's Company. And Three's Company is going to be a recurring theme as well. And I'll explain in just a moment, because I believe I've mentioned it on the podcast before. So, 77, 78. I'm 3 and almost 4 years old in this time period. But I remember, and I believe it was a Thursday night TV block. Maybe I have this wrong. It was either Tuesday or Thursday, I think. Here's your 1, 2, and 3. And I just remember them being on all at the same time. I think they were all on the same night, all on ABC. Laverne and Shirley, once again on top. Happy Days, Three's Company. But then rounding out your top 10, and again, they're doing the tied for 4. Anyway, let's see. Laverne and Shirley, Happy Days, Three's Company, 60 Minutes, which is interesting. They kind of come up and down. And I guess just certain years, they have more interesting programs, more interesting topics that they're going over, some interesting interviews. Charlie's Angels, All in the Family, still around kicking in 77. Little House on the Prairie. Alice. So again, if you listen to my episode on theme songs, you'll know that a lot of these shows we've talked about. MASH, One Day at a Time. That's your top 10. So here's where it just gets more and more fascinating with Happy Days. Because as you may remember, there were more than one spinoffs of Happy Days. So, of course, you had Laverne and Shirley. Later on, you had Joni Loves Chachi, which I don't think I saw on this list at all anywhere. We'll take a look in a minute. But also Mork and Mindy. ABC is dominating. Laverne and Shirley, Three's Company, Mork and Mindy, Happy Days. So again, 2 spin-off shows are outpacing the original series, although Mork and Mindy and Happy Days are tied in 78, 79. Angie, remember that one? I can see it like plain as day. What was her name? Angie. Oh, can I get it before I hit the link? Angie. Donna Pascal. Yep, that's her. Donna Pascal and Robert Hayes. Oh my gosh. Doris Roberts as her mother. Okay, anyway. So now, here's 60 Minutes. Here's MASH. And now we have a Three's Company spinoff. I didn't realize how strong the Ropers came out of the gate. Top 10 show right out of the gate. All in the Family, still here, still in the top 10. Followed by Taxi. Now, number 11 on the list, just outside of the top 10. I have a funny story about this. And honestly, I didn't know how to handle it because I've said it before. I'm weird about social media. In some ways, I'm good at it. In other ways, I'm atrocious at it. So, I did the Yacht Rock episode, right? And I did my social media posts. So on Instagram, I went ahead and I always will put up a picture, right, to accompany the content. Like a picture that, and I'll be perfectly honest, I use a bunch of different software to do it, and I try to recreate something that feels like the topic, looks like the topic, gives you some kind of visual cue of what it is that I'm working with. And I oftentimes, particularly on Instagram, accompany it with music. So for the Yacht Rock episode, of course, I'm going to use Seals and Croft, right? I'm just going to see it right here. I'm going to look at it because I want to make sure that I wasn't hallucinating it. Let's see. Is it still there? Yep, it's still there. So I get a like from a blue check mark, which I don't typically get. Now, this is not like Twitter where I am a guilty as charged, purchase my blue check mark just to try to drive engagement. Totally admitted. Okay. But I look at the name and I'm like, wait a minute. I recognize that name. And I look closer again. And Betty Buckley liked my Yacht Rock post. So, of course, number 11, 8 is enough. And Betty Buckley played Sandra. Abby, right? Is that her name? Sandra Sue Abby Abbott. Abby and Tom, they get married on the show. Betty Buckley liked it. Now, for anyone who maybe didn't watch 8 is Enough, maybe you're a younger Xer or you just never got into it, she's also been in like a couple of M. Night Shyamalan movies. Most recently, she was in Split. Anyway, I was blown away. I didn't know really how to act because I wanted to act like an idiot and be like, oh my gosh, Betty Buckley liked my post. But then that seemed weird, so I didn't do it. Anyway, so cool. But let's get back to the list. So 79 and 80, 60 Minutes, back up on top. Must have had some cool news stories there. Three's Company, but then number 3, I saw this, and I'm like, oh my gosh. Do you remember a little show with Kathy Lee Crosby, John Davidson, who was, I think, most well known for Hollywood Squares, the remade version in the 80s and 90s, and former Minnesota Vikings quarterback Fran Tarkenton. That's right. I'm talking about That's Incredible. I loved that show. And it's like one of the first that's honestly, it's a mixture of stunts and paranormal. It's like a little bit of Jackass. It's like Ripley's Believe It or Not. It's like all kind of things all mixing together. And it was actually called at one point Sadistic. Accusations of being sadistic. But the series was a huge success and influenced many entertainers. Yeah, of course it did. Of course it did. It was crazy. But I remember seeing some things on there and being like, wow, that's incredible. Followed by Alice, MASH, Dallas, first making its appearance on the list. Actually, okay, Dallas. Which reminds me of Larry Hagman. And I don't remember. It would have been in the 60s. And yeah, just making sure that I Dream of Jeannie was actually as big as I thought it was. Looks like it was never a top 10 show, but looks like it certainly was doing okay. Bewitched seemed to have outperformed it, which kind of makes sense. Anyway, Dallas is on the list here. Where was I? There we are. But that was Dallas's first time being on the list. Flo, which is a spinoff of Alice. Kiss My Grits. The Jeffersons. The Dukes of Hazzard here in the top 10. And One Day at a Time. At this point, All in the Family had been rebranded as Archie Bunker's Place. Still here, just outside the top 10. So then, here we are. We've arrived in the 80s. And I don't recall the 80s being a huge, like, well, I guess with going, you can go back to like the 60s and like the Westerns, there's always been just a kind of affinity on a nationwide level for things that were kind of Southern. So from Dallas to the Dukes of Hazzard, that's here you have, your top 2 shows here. So Dallas, Dukes of Hazzard, 60 Minutes, MASH, The Love Boat. Freaking love The Love Boat. How could you not? Especially when Charo was on. Coochie Coochie. The Jeffersons, Alice, House Calls? What's House Calls? Wayne Rogers and Lynn Redgrave. No kidding. And then Sharon Gless. They replaced her? I don't know the story. Weird. Okay. Let's see. House Calls, Three's Company, and rounding up the top 10, Little House on the Prairie. Which, by the way, Michael Landon basically had been on television in hit shows going all the way back to, like, the 60s. And he continues on right through the 80s. Amazing. So in 81, 82, you have Dallas, 60 Minutes, The Jeffersons now all by itself, in the sitcom world. Three's Company still hanging on. Alice, Dukes of Hazzard, Too Close for Comfort. There you go. My Guy Ted Knight, ABC Monday Night Movie, MASH, and One Day at a Time. Now here's what's interesting as I'm going through. So here we are in 82, 83. 60 Minutes is back on top. And Dallas, MASH, Magnum PI is now on here. And now CBS has now for the past couple of seasons been firmly in the top spot. And I remember this being a TV guide conversation or the entertainment magazines talking about which network was dominant in that top 10 space. And it seemed like it was cyclical, right? So I remember ABC was on top, and then CBS was on top. And I think we get into the 90s or the late 80s and 90s. I think it's NBC again. And then NBC had this dominant block, and it was all about programming and counter programming. These are competitive things. But let's see here. So I think this is the last year. Yes. Okay. So one of the things that I found so interesting is that as a standalone, let's go week to week ratings, MASH was never higher than number 3, which is where they are here. So like I said, it goes 60 Minutes, Dallas, MASH, Magnum, Dynasty, Three's Company, Simon and Simon now making the list. My grandmother loved that show. Daryl McRaney, she loved him. Falcon Crest, The Love Boat, The A-Team, A Pity the Fool, and Monday Night Football. But MASH, in 1983, had the top-rated television show, right? The most watched episode of a TV show in history happened in 1983. Now, it has since been surpassed. But going all the way back to the 1950s, so in 30-plus years of television, MASH had the number 1 show for that night, and that record, which I think stood for like maybe a decade, never was a number 1 show for a full season. I figured that was going to be MASH, 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 MASH. Never the case, which is crazy to me. Absolutely crazy to me. But that's another thing, you would watch on sick days. At least I did, because it was in syndication like immediately. And I used to love watching MASH. And Radar O'Reilly, Gary Berghoff, he's actually a customer of my stepdad's at one point. Very nice guy. So 1983 to 1984, and this just screams to me like this is peak 80s right here. Holy cow. Dallas, 60 Minutes, Dynasty, The A-Team, Simon and Simon, Magnum PI, Falcon Crest, Kate and Allie. Loved Kate and Allie because I totally crushed on the oldest daughter. I forget whose daughter because they each had their own kids. Hotel, Cagney and Lacey. I mean, holy cow. This is like right out of my memories right there. Like that is, yeah. Cause I mean, I'm 10, right? Yeah, between 9 and 10. Like this was like peak, but like Dallas and Dynasty being in, right there against each other. That's just unbelievable. And I feel like people had kind of like almost like a rivalry there too. I feel like there were like Dallas people and like Dynasty people. And I don't know what it says about who is who in that particular scenario. Oh, here we are. 84-85. Dynasty Dallas. Well, this might even be more peak 80s. The Cosby Show in 3. 60 Minutes. Family Ties. The A-Team. Simon and Simon. Murder, She Wrote. Knots Landing. Falcon Crest. And Crazy Like a Fox. Remember Crazy Like a Fox? Oh, my gosh. Yeah. It's hilarious. But what's interesting, too, is that, let's see. We'll talk about that show in just a minute. Because it's very similar in some ways to MASH, with one season exception. So I talked about how you had your kind of alternation, not just with the networks, but between comedy and drama and comedy and drama and, news, reality, whatever you want to call it. But in 1985, it's back to being a whole lot of sitcoms being firmly entrenched in your top 10 with a couple of kind of, like I said, competing soap operas, but then another really dramatic show. So your top 10 in 85, 86, Cosby Show, Family Ties, Murder, She Wrote, 60 Minutes, Cheers, Dallas Dynasty, The Golden Girls, Miami Vice, and Who's the Boss now joining in, with NBC being in the top 2 spots. But by 86, 87, top 3 spots. Straight up NBC, Cosby, Family Ties, Cheers. I mean, just right there. There they are. And legendary. Now, no surprise here. The Cosby Show. So 87, 88, Cosby Show, A Different World, Cheers. I'm not sure if they might have changed nights on Family Ties now that I think about it. But I do remember Cosby, Different World, Cheers. That's like that. Oh, and Golden Girls. That's like your Thursday night block, right? 88, Cosby. It's like, so it goes like this for Cosby. Enters the charts in 84, 85 at number 3. But then from 85 through 90, it's the top show. So 5 years straight up, all about the Cosby Show, which is so sad. Like for all of the other performers not named Bill Cosby who have had their history and their legacies tainted, because it was brilliant and it was such a great show, and it broke so many barriers and stereotypes and all those kind of things, and it spoke to everyone. And now you can't watch it because like there's just this specter. I saw it live. I saw a taping of the Cosby Show. It was the coolest freaking thing. And the director of the episode, it was Theo himself. I mean, Malcolm Jamal Warner. I don't know why that didn't come to me right now. I got his first name, so I'll give myself that. But anyway, so NBC firmly on top. 87, 88. It's, Cosby, Different World, Cheers, and Golden Girls. I mean, this is basically it until 60 Minutes pops in there again, and Roseanne has now risen to the top. Like Roseanne came in at 88, 89, did a couple of seasons at number 2. But in 1990, and this is where I'm gonna end, because I just said I was going to get through the 70s and the 80s, okay? All this time, Cheers has been creeping, but never making it to the top spot. Its second to last season, it became the top show. Because it ended in 92. Actually, it ended in 93? Really? I thought that was my senior year. So it peaked in 91, and its last season, which I thought did huge numbers for that finale, and we went to Boston to see it, it was number 8 in its last season. That's fascinating. When did Roseanne? I thought Roseanne made it to the top, but no. Roseanne never made it into the top spot because Cosby was always there. And even when Cosby fell, Cheers went into that top spot. So interesting to me. But yeah, when you get into the 90s, I thought it took longer, but yeah, by 94, Seinfeld had then become the top show. So 93, Seinfeld was at 3, and it became the top show. And then it did a couple of, it was only 1 year. Seinfeld was locked into a 4-year battle, 4 or 5 year battle with ER, also on its same network. This was all NBC. And did you remember that Suddenly Susan with Brooke Shields? Top 3 show for 96, 97. I did not know that show ran from 96 to 2000. No idea. I thought it was really quick and in and out and done. But yeah, it's just so curious to me. And just some of the shows that became like instant hits and then just disappeared. Particularly some of those 90s shows. But, towards the middle 80s, I'm just going to blurt out some of these. You have 227, Night Court, Highway to Heaven. Kate and Allie would always sitting around the top 10. Let's see. Scarecrow and Mrs. King. Newhart. I loved Newhart. I thought that was much higher on the list than it is. But it looked like it was always just kind of somewhere in the 16, 17, 18 range. Yeah, it looks like the highest Newhart got was 12. I don't know. I just loved that show. I love Bob Newhart's humor. I watched a little bit of his first show, which was late 70s, early 80s, the Bob Newhart show. And just something about his delivery. I mean, that's what makes it funny, right? There's something about it. And it's so deadpan, but he means well. He's just a curmudgeon. And I relate to that so much. Just Bob's whole thing. I love it. So it's really kind of an interesting mix just to see the competition and how it seems as though more often than not, the United States of America was definitely all about the family sitcom. I mean, when did that change, if it did at all? Yeah, I mean, like I said, Seinfeld and ER going back and forth. I mean, so the Who Wants to Be Millionaire phase. So just the game show, which always tends to pop up. And here we have in 2000, I'm just jumping ahead a little bit, your full reality shows, your Survivors on the list, ER is still kicking around. And then in 2001, wait a minute. Friends only had one season where it was the number one show on television? In 2001 to 2? Wow. And then by the time you get to 2004-5, American Idol then just dominated. No kidding. I mean, that was like the thing up until NCIS. Huh. Well, anyway, TV rankings. Just kind of doing a little dive through history. I find it so interesting how some of the spinoffs were actually stronger from a ratings perspective from the actual, original show. Everything from the Jeffersons outpacing All in the Family. That whole lineage of the Happy Days tree, I think, is so interesting. I still think I don't know. Laverne and Shirley came out stronger even in its first year spinning off. I mean, what was the first year for Happy Days? Because I know they had those first 2 seasons. So let's see. So it started in 74. Laverne and Shirley started in 76 and immediately was a bigger hit. But then obviously I think what happened is Happy Days moved into not just the reformatting of the set and how it was shot, like Fonzie becoming like the main character. I think that was the turning point for that show. But yeah, just glancing through here, it is a walk down memory lane. Soap. Welcome Back, Kotter. I mean, I totally forgot about that. That looks like it peaked top 13. Yeah, top 13. That's as high as it made. And of course that, spat off one of the biggest superstars in the history of film. Fantasy Island. I'm going to do an episode just on Fantasy Island. I should just do a walkthrough with someone. That show got dark. There's some dark stuff happened there. In part, every opening of this show, when I say, welcome to the Stuck in the Middle podcast, I'm your host. It's really me just channeling the, welcome to Fantasy Island. I am your host, Mr. Rourke. Got to love. Ricardo Montalban, Hervé Villachez, that show. I love how they say it right here. There was a horror version, like straight up horror movie that came out in 2020, but I didn't see it. I think they were hoping for that to be like the kickoff of a franchise, but a lot of really interesting, cool TV from the 70s and the 80s. And tell me, is there anything that surprised you that wasn't a bigger hit? Is there anything that you think I missed that I don't know, somehow my brain didn't work and I didn't read it? And you're going, no, I know that show was number one and you didn't say it. Let me know. Absolutely. And I think one of the other things is, let me know if you like this type of episode. Now, of course, I'm going to find that out purely by numbers. But if there's particular content that you like, dislike, you can also let me know that as well. And I guess I will post a poll sometime this week with just some high-level questions. If you'd mind just going out there, just like, what kind of content do you like? Do you like to talk more about music, television, movies? Are there topics that you'd be interested in that I haven't covered? Always looking to do new things. And I have to say, here I am 75 episodes in, and I think I really need to have a co-host. So if you listen to the show, maybe you've done a podcast before, and I don't know, maybe you're a friend, maybe you're someone I've never met before, but who knows? Maybe you'd like to try your hand. Maybe we'll do some auditions for those who might be interested. Bear in mind, this pays nothing. But I don't know what my upside is when it's just me, because I don't think I'm that interesting. And the fact that y'all keep coming back week after week, thank you. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. It's why I keep doing it. Episode 75 in the books. That rules. Obviously, next is 100. That's the next benchmark. And I'm definitely doing something big for episode 100. So, hey, let me know your feedback. Let me know if you're interested in maybe, I don't know, co-hosting the show. How do you do that? You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, X, and YouTube at StuckPodX. You can head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. Please like, share, comment, leave 5-star reviews, and most importantly, please subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, later, slackers.